March 22, 1945. The west bank of the Rhine River, Nierstein, Germany. Through the dim moonlight, Obergefreiter Klaus Hermann pressed his eye against the rubber rim of his binoculars, scanning the far shore where American forces had been massing since dusk. The defensive doctrine was clear. The Rhine was Germany's final western barrier, a river so formidable that even Napoleon had struggled to force its crossing. Hermann's unit, the remnants of the 15th Army's 358th Volksgrenadier Division, had spent weeks preparing positions along the eastern bank. Every calculation, every tactical assumption, centered on one inviolable principle. Rivers were where invasions died. The Wehrmacht had studied amphibious operations exhaustively. Crossing a major river required landing craft that approached the shore, unloaded at the waterline, then withdrew. This transition point, where water met land, was where attacking forces were most vulnerable. German artillery positions were zeroed in on these killing zones. Machine gun nests covered every potential beach. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. American forces would need to establish a beachhead, build up supplies at the water's edge, then push inland. Each phase offered opportunities to bleed the attackers white. At 0200 hours, Hermann heard the engines, distant at first, then growing louder. Dozens of motors, perhaps hundreds, approaching through the darkness. He adjusted his binoculars, expecting to see the familiar silhouettes of American landing craft, the flat-bottomed boats that had carried troops across the English Channel. What he saw instead made him lower the binoculars, wipe the lenses carefully, and look again. Vehicles were emerging from the Rhine itself, not landing craft, unloading at the shore. Actual trucks, climbing directly from the water onto the eastern bank without pause, their wheels churning through the shallows, as if the boundary between river and land simply did not exist. Hermann watched one vehicle complete its transition in perhaps 20 seconds. It drove through waist-deep water, up the muddy bank, across a stretch of sand that German engineers had specifically chosen to bog down wheeled vehicles, and accelerated onto the road beyond. By the time Hermann reached for his radio to report this impossibility, 6 more vehicles had followed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The vehicles were DUKW's, General Motors Corporation's amphibious modification of the standard 2.5-ton truck. The designation came from GMC's internal nomenclature. D indicated the 1942 design year. U meant utility amphibious. K signified all-wheel drive. W denoted dual rear axles. American soldiers had simplified this to duck, a nickname that captured the vehicle's ability to operate in both elements. What German defenders like Hermann were witnessing represented a fundamental reimagining of river crossing operations, one that German military doctrine had never anticipated. The technical specifications seemed unremarkable on paper. Each DUKW weighed 6.5 tons empty. Powered by a GMC 270 cubic inch straight-six engine producing 94 horsepower, the vehicle measured 31 feet long, 8 feet wide, and nearly 9 feet high with its canvas top raised. The hull was constructed from thin sheet steel, 1/16 to 1/8 inch thick, designed for buoyancy rather than protection. A single 3-bladed propeller at the rear provided water propulsion. 6-wheel drive delivered traction on land. But these modest specifications concealed capabilities that shattered German assumptions about amphibious warfare. In water, the DUKW could maintain 6 miles per hour, slow by boat standards but adequate for river crossings. On land, the same vehicle could accelerate to 50 miles per hour on decent roads. Most critically, the transition between these two modes of operation required no pause, no unloading, no vulnerable moment of transfer. The DUKW simply drove from river to shore to inland road as if all three were merely different types of terrain to be crossed. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann, commanding a 75mm anti-tank gun position 300 meters from the riverbank, had calculated firing solutions for every likely landing zone. His crew had practiced engaging landing craft during their approach, during unloading, and during the critical minutes when supplies would be transferred from boat to shore. At 02:15 hours, he watched through his gun sight as an American amphibious truck emerged from the Rhine, paused for perhaps 5 seconds to gain traction on the bank, then accelerated directly toward his position. Hoffmann ordered his crew to track the target. The gun traversed smoothly. The loader slammed a shell into the breech, but the DUKW was already moving at 30 miles per hour, weaving slightly on the rough ground, presenting a moving target far more difficult to engage than the stationary landing craft they had anticipated. Hoffmann fired anyway. The shell passed behind the vehicle's rear axle by 2 meters. By the time the loader had prepared a second round, the DUKW had disappeared into the darkness, having traveled over 200 meters in less than 20 seconds. What Hoffmann couldn't know was that this vehicle carried not soldiers, but artillery ammunition. 24 shells for American 105mm howitzers, delivered directly from a supply ship anchored in the Rhine to a gun position 2 kilometers inland. Traditional amphibious doctrine required ammunition to be unloaded at the beach, stacked into dumps vulnerable to artillery fire, then distributed forward by truck. The DUKW eliminated every step of this vulnerable process. Ammunition flowed, like water, finding its own level, impossible to interdict. The design originated in 1942 from an unlikely collaboration. Rod Stevens Jr., a yacht designer from Sparkman and Stevens Incorporated, Dennis Pouliston, a British deep-water sailor living in America, and Frank W. Spear, an engineer from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had conceived an amphibious truck to solve the problem of resupplying units immediately after beach landings. The military initially rejected the concept as impractical. Boats were boats, trucks were trucks. Combining them seemed to violate fundamental categories. The demonstration that changed military minds occurred near Provincetown, Massachusetts. A Coast Guard patrol craft ran aground on a sandbar in conditions that defeated conventional rescue vessels. Winds reached 60 knots. Heavy surf made approach impossible for standard boats. An experimental DUKW, in the area for testing, drove through conditions that had stopped all other craft and rescued 7 stranded Coast Guardsmen. Within weeks, General Motors received orders for mass production. By March 1945, over 21,000 DUKWs had rolled off American assembly lines. The production philosophy represented something German manufacturing could never match. Each vehicle required 18,000 separate parts, sourced from 300 suppliers across 30 states. Yet, assembly line workers who had built commercial trucks on Friday were building amphibious vehicles on Monday, using the same tools, the same processes, the same standardized components. The DUKW shared 85% of its parts with the standard GMC CCKW truck, meaning maintenance required no specialized training and spare parts existed in abundance. Obergefreiter Hermann finally reached his company commander by field telephone. Herr Hauptmann, the Americans are using vehicles that swim across the river, then drive inland at full speed. They don't stop at the waterline. They don't unload. They just continue as if the river doesn't exist. There was a long pause before the captain responded. Are you certain these aren't tracked amphibious vehicles? We've had reports of American LVTs. No, sir. 6 wheels. Truck configuration. I watched one cross from mid-river to the road beyond our minefields in under 1 minute. Another pause. Hold your position. I'm reporting this to regimental headquarters. But regimental headquarters had already received dozens of similar reports. From observation posts up and down the Rhine, German officers were describing the same phenomenon. American logistics had achieved something German tactical thinking deemed impossible. The transition from water to land, the boundary German defensive doctrine depended upon, had become meaningless. The DUKW's tire inflation system particularly amazed German observers who later examined captured vehicles. A 2-cylinder air compressor and storage tank allowed drivers to adjust tire pressure from the dashboard while moving. Fully inflated tires provided maximum speed on paved roads. Deflated tires spread the vehicle's weight across a larger surface area, preventing it from sinking into soft ground. German engineers had struggled to produce reliable standard pressure tire valves. Americans had made variable pressure adjustment routine equipment on every amphibious truck. This innovation solved one of the Rhine crossing's greatest challenges. German engineers had analyzed the soil composition along potential invasion routes. Sandy stretches near the waterline would bog down wheeled vehicles, forcing attackers to use tracked transporters or build corduroy roads from logs. But DUKWs simply deflated their tires upon reaching soft ground, crawled across surfaces that stopped conventional trucks, then re-inflated once they reached solid terrain. Hermann watched this process repeat throughout the night. Vehicles that seemed stuck would pause, sink slightly lower, as their tires spread wider, then drive out of ground that should have trapped them. The six-wheel drive system multiplied this capability. Traditional four-wheel drive vehicles lost traction when two wheels encountered obstacles or soft surfaces. The DUKW's six-driven wheels meant that even if two wheels slipped, four remained engaged. Combined with the ability to adjust tire pressure on the move, the vehicle could traverse terrain German tactical planning had designated as impassable to wheeled transport. By 400 hours, General George S. Patton's Third Army had established a beachhead 6 miles deep across the Rhine at Nierstein. German defensive positions, designed to contest every metre of the eastern bank, had been bypassed by an endless stream of vehicles that simply ignored the river as an obstacle. Hermann's unit received orders to fall back to secondary positions 5 kilometres inland. The retreat began in darkness and confusion, German soldiers scrambling to disengage while American DUKWs continued to shuttle supplies forward. Hauptmann Werner Richter, operations officer for the 358th Volksgrenadier Division, compiled the night's action reports as dawn broke. The numbers defied belief. American forces had transported over 15,000 men and 1,200 vehicles across the Rhine in less than 12 hours. Traditional landing craft had ferried some troops, but the DUKWs had sustained a pace that conventional amphibious operations could never achieve. Each vehicle made multiple round trips, no congestion at the waterline, no vulnerable supply dumps, no pause in the flow of men and material. Richter had studied amphibious warfare at the War Academy in Berlin. Every manual, every tactical study, every historical analysis emphasized the same principle. River crossings succeeded or failed at the beach. Defenders concentrated fire on landing zones. Attackers struggled to establish supply lines from ship to shore to inland. Positions. The transition between water and land consumed time, created vulnerabilities, and determined outcomes. The Americans had eliminated the transition. Their amphibious trucks made the Rhine simply another road, slightly slower than pavement but navigable without specialized craft or elaborate unloading procedures. Richter understood immediately what this meant. Every German defensive position along every river in Europe had been rendered obsolete by a vehicle that treated water as merely another type of terrain. What German officers couldn't see was the deeper revolution the DUKW represented. American military logistics operated on principles foreign to Wehrmacht thinking. Where German doctrine emphasized conservation and specialization, Americans relied on abundance and standardization. Where Germans built equipment to be preserved and maintained meticulously, Americans designed vehicles expecting them to be used hard, damaged, and replaced. The DUKW embodied this philosophy. It wasn't particularly durable. Its thin hull could be punctured by small arms fire. Its automotive components wore out quickly under combat conditions, but American factories were producing them faster than combat could destroy them. The production capacity behind the DUKW astounded German intelligence analysts. General Motors' Pontiac plant produced 300 vehicles per month at peak output. The Yellow Truck and Coach facility in Pontiac, Michigan, and the GMC Truck Division in St. Louis together exceeded this figure. By comparison, Germany's entire automotive industry struggled to produce 500 military trucks of all types monthly by 1945. The Americans were building more amphibious vehicles in a month than Germany built total trucks in the same period. Lieutenant Hoffmann's anti-tank crew captured an abandoned DUKW later that morning. The vehicle had thrown a track, actually a propeller shaft bearing had failed, and its crew had disabled it before, retreating. Hoffmann's men examined it carefully, hoping to understand what they had faced during the night. The engine, when they traced its components, was identical to engines in standard American trucks. The transmission, transfer case, and axles could be found on thousands of non-amphibious vehicles. The radio equipment was standard issue. Even the weapons mount, a ring for a .50 caliber machine gun, used the same hardware as American jeeps and trucks. "It's not a specialized military vehicle," Hoffmann reported to Hauptmann Richter. "It's a truck with a boat hull attached. Any mechanic who can repair a standard truck can fix this. Any driver trained on normal vehicles can operate it. They've taken ordinary equipment and made it amphibious without adding complexity." This observation cut to the heart of German defeat. The Wehrmacht had developed specialized equipment for specialized roles. Amphibious operations required specialized landing craft, specialized training, specialized logistics. The Americans had democratized amphibious warfare, making it accessible to regular troops using equipment that required no special expertise. A farm boy from Iowa could learn to drive a DUKW in days. A mechanic from Detroit could repair it using standard tools and interchangeable parts. The barrier between land and water warfare had been reduced to a lever that engaged or disengaged the propeller. By mid-morning, American artillery was firing without restriction on targets 15 kilometers inland. The DUKWs had delivered sufficient ammunition to sustain bombardments that German forces hadn't experienced since 1943. Each vehicle carried 2.5 tons of cargo, roughly equivalent to 120 artillery shells. A steady stream of perhaps 50 vehicles could deliver 6,000 shells per hour to forward gun positions. German counter-battery fire struck empty beaches. American supply dumps had become moving targets, impossible to locate and destroy. The psychological impact matched the practical effect. German soldiers along the Rhine had been told they defended the fatherland's last natural barrier. The river was supposed to delay the American advance for weeks, perhaps months. The defensive positions represented months of labor. Artillery fields of fire had been carefully calculated. Machine gun positions covered every approach. Minefields blocked likely exit routes from the river. All of it predicated on the assumption that Americans would need to establish beachheads, build up supplies at vulnerable points, then push inland in a deliberate, costly advance. Instead, American forces had simply driven across the Rhine and continued eastward. The Great River Barrier had been reduced to a 20-minute inconvenience. German defensive doctrine, refined through years of combat experience, had been rendered irrelevant by six-wheeled trucks with boat hulls. Obergefreiter Hermann's company fell back through 3 positions during the daylight hours of March 23rd. At each position, they established fields of fire, prepared to contest the American advance, then received orders to withdraw before engaging. American armor, supported by amphibious trucks, was advancing too rapidly for German infantry to establish stable defensive lines. The speed of advance shocked Hermann more than the Rhine crossing itself. His training taught that attacking forces advanced 10 to 15 kilometers per day when opposed. The Americans were covering 30 kilometers daily, sustained by logistics that never paused. The DUKWs enabled this pace in ways Hermann only gradually understood. Traditional military advance required establishment of supply depots at regular intervals. Fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement parts flowed through these fixed points. Attacking the depots or the supply lines feeding them could slow or halt an enemy offensive, but American supply trucks that could swim meant depots could be anywhere. A DUKW could ford the Rhine at any point along hundreds of kilometers of riverfront. German forces couldn't interdict supply lines that had no fixed location. The night of March 23rd, Hermann's unit dug in at a village 12 kilometers east of the Rhine. An old farmer, forced from his home to make room for defensive positions, stood watching the soldiers work. "The Americans will be here by tomorrow night," the farmer said quietly. "We'll hold them here," Hermann replied, not believing it himself. "I heard their trucks all last night. They didn't stop. Not for an hour. Not for a minute. Just engines and more engines, crossing the river as if it wasn't even there." The farmer shook his head. "We can't fight that. No one can fight that." Hermann wanted to argue, to defend the Wehrmacht's capability, to insist that German soldiers could stop any advance with proper tactics and leadership, but he had seen the DUKWs crossing the Rhine. He had watched vehicles drive through water, up banks, across ground that should have stopped them, and accelerate toward German positions at speeds that made them nearly impossible to target. He had seen American supply operations that functioned without the vulnerabilities German doctrine depended upon exploiting. The farmer was right. They couldn't fight this. Not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the Americans had changed the fundamental nature of river crossing operations. They had eliminated the boundary between water and land warfare. They had created logistics faster than German forces could disrupt. They had industrialized amphibious assault until it became routine, requiring no special craft, no specialized training, no elaborate preparation. The DUKW wasn't the weapon that defeated Germany, but it represented perfectly the gulf between American and German capability by 1945. The Americans could conceive, design, and mass-produce 21,000 amphibious vehicles, while fighting a global war. They could standardize components across hundreds of vehicle types, enabling any mechanic to repair any equipment. They could deploy technology that transformed tactical impossibilities into routine operations. The morning of March 24, 1945 brought confirmation of what Hermann had witnessed the previous night. American forces weren't just crossing the Rhine at Nierstein. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group had launched Operation Plunder farther north near Wesel. British, Canadian, and American units were forcing crossings along a 22-mile front. And everywhere, the reports were the same. American amphibious trucks were turning rivers into highways. Hauptfeldwebel Ernst Müller, a veteran of the Eastern Front now defending near Oberwesel, watched through artillery smoke as the 89th United States Infantry Division approached his sector. The Americans had attempted their crossing initially using unprotected DUKWs, and German fire had inflicted casualties. But the vehicles that survived simply continued inland, delivering their cargo of troops and supplies before returning for another load. Traditional landing craft would have withdrawn after the first casualties, forcing a reorganization of the assault. The DUKWs absorbed losses and maintained tempo. They treat vehicles the way we treat ammunition. Müller observed to his gun crew, "Fire one, lose one, fire another. They have so many it doesn't matter." This was precisely correct. American doctrine assumed a 30% mechanical failure rate and planned accordingly. If 7 DUKWs out of 10 completed their mission, the operation succeeded. Germans, operating with scarce resources, needed 90% success rates just to maintain operations. The psychological gap was as wide as the material one. American commanders could accept losses that would have been catastrophic to German logistics. The DUKW's versatility compounded German defensive problems. Within a single hour, Müller watched the same vehicle type serve 4 different roles. First, a DUKW delivered ammunition to American artillery positions. Then another transported wounded soldiers back across the Rhine, converted into an ambulance with stretcher racks mounted in its cargo bed. A third brought fresh troops forward to reinforce positions under German counterattack. A fourth carried a portable radio station, enabling American commanders to coordinate operations while mobile. "How do you defend against equipment that has no pattern?" Müller asked rhetorically. "Their supply trucks, then ambulances, then troop carriers, then command posts. Every defensive calculation becomes meaningless." German military doctrine emphasized specialization. Ambulances were ambulances. Supply trucks were supply trucks. Each vehicle type required specific tactics to counter. But the Americans had created a universal platform that filled whatever role the moment demanded. The flexibility made German defensive planning nearly impossible. Artillery officers couldn't predict supply routes. Infantry couldn't anticipate where reinforcements would appear. The DUKWs flowed like water, filling gaps, exploiting opportunities, responding to changing conditions faster than German forces could react. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical features that enabled this flexibility impressed German engineers who examined, captured, or destroyed vehicles. The central tire inflation system proved particularly ingenious. Most military vehicles required soldiers to exit and manually adjust tire pressure using hand pumps, a process taking 10 to 15 minutes per vehicle. The DUKW's dashboard-mounted system allowed pressure changes while moving. A driver approaching soft ground could deflate all 6 tires in seconds. Upon reaching solid terrain, the same tires could be re-inflated without stopping. Oberleutnant Hans Dietrich, a technical officer with the 15th Army's Engineering Battalion, dismantled a captured DUKW's inflation system. "Every component already exists in standard vehicles," he reported. "The air compressor is from a truck brake system. The pressure gauge is standard equipment. The distribution valves are modified fuel line fittings. They've created sophisticated capability using ordinary parts." This design philosophy permeated every aspect of the DUKW. The propeller was a modified ship's screw. The rudder used the same steering mechanisms as the front wheels. The bilge pumps were commercial marine equipment. The radio mounts, weapon rings, and tool storage matched standard military trucks. Nothing about the vehicle required specialized manufacturing. Any factory that could build trucks could build DUKWs. Any worker trained in automotive assembly could construct them. Any mechanic with basic skills could maintain them. Germany had attempted its own amphibious vehicle program. The Type 2 Car Me, manufactured by Toyota, was designed to fulfill a similar role, but Japan managed to produce only 198 units between 1943 and 1944, and most were lost when American submarines sank their transport ships. The fundamental difference wasn't technological knowledge, but industrial philosophy. German and Japanese manufacturers built precision equipment in limited quantities. Americans built good enough equipment in overwhelming numbers. Hauptmann Werner Richter compiled intelligence reports on DUKW operations across multiple river crossings. The pattern was consistent and devastating to German defensive doctrine. At the Moselle River, American forces had used DUTWs to cross at unexpected locations, bypassing prepared defenses entirely. At the Saar River, the vehicles had delivered artillery pieces directly to forward positions, eliminating the time required to establish gun emplacements through traditional means. At the Waal River during Operation Market Garden, DUKWs had transported supplies across water obstacles that German planners believed would protect their flanks. "Every river we considered a defensive asset has become a minor inconvenience to them," Richter wrote in his assessment. "The Americans cross water the way we cross roads. The entire foundation of our defensive strategy assumed that rivers would slow their advance. This assumption is no longer valid." The speed of crossing particularly alarmed German tactical planners. Traditional river assault required hours of preparation. Landing craft had to be brought forward, troops embarked, approaches coordinated, artillery support arranged. The actual crossing might take 30 minutes, but the entire operation consumed most of a day. DUKWs required no preparation beyond loading them with cargo or troops. They drove to the river, entered the water, crossed at 6 miles per hour, and continued inland. The time from departure to arrival at inland objectives could be under an hour. This compression of time eliminated German defenders' ability to respond. By the time reconnaissance reported American forces massing at a river, DUKWs were already crossing. By the time artillery could be repositioned to engage the crossing point, the vehicles had dispersed inland. By the time reinforcements arrived to contest the beachhead, American forces had established positions kilometers beyond the riverbank. The tempo of operations had accelerated beyond Wehrmacht decision-making cycles. General Major Kurt Felber, commanding the remnants of the 7th Army near the Rhine, received situation reports throughout March 24th. Every report contained some variation of the same information. American amphibious vehicles were crossing rivers at will. German defensive positions were being bypassed. Supply lines that should have been vulnerable were proving impossible to interdict. Artillery fire that should have halted crossings was striking empty water or mud. Felber had fought across Europe for 5 years. He had commanded troops in Poland, France, Russia, and now Germany itself. He understood military logistics intimately. The fundamental principle was simple. Armies moved at the speed of their supply lines. Fast-moving armoured forces inevitably outran their logistics, creating a culminating point where advance stopped while supplies caught up. Every German offensive had encountered this limitation. Every Soviet offensive had stalled for the same reason. It was physics, not tactics. But the Americans seemed to have repealed this physical law. Their armour advanced 40 to 60 kilometres daily, sustained by supply trucks that swam. There was no culminating point because there was no vulnerable supply line to extend and break. The DUKWs created a logistics pipeline that functioned regardless of terrain, weather, or enemy action. Rivers that should have forced operational pauses became mere speed bumps. "How do we fight an enemy whose supplies travel faster than our reinforcements?" Felber asked his staff. No one had an answer. The DUKW's payload capacity of 2.5 tons seemed modest compared to larger supply vehicles, but the ability to deliver those 2.5 tons directly from ship to front line without transshipment multiplied its effective capacity. A traditional supply chain required goods to be unloaded from ships to landing craft, from landing craft to beach dumps, from beach dumps to trucks, from trucks to forward depots, from forward depots to combat units. Each transfer consumed time and created vulnerability. The DUKW eliminated every intermediate step. Obergefreiter Klaus Hermann experienced this logistics revolution from the receiving end. His unit was allocated 30 artillery shells per day for their 75mm anti-tank gun. This allocation hadn't changed in weeks, despite increasing combat intensity. German supply officers explained that transportation capacity limited deliveries. Trucks were scarce, fuel was scarcer. The shells existed in depots farther east, but moving them forward exceeded available resources. Meanwhile, American artillery units 2 kilometers away fired without apparent restriction. Hermann counted the incoming rounds during one 4-hour period. Over 800 shells impacted his division's sector. The mathematics was staggering. If American guns were firing 800 shells in 4 hours, they were consuming 200 shells per hour. Each DUKW could deliver approximately 60 shells per trip. 4 trips per vehicle would deliver the ammunition American artillery was expending. 8 DUKWs operating continuously could sustain a bombardment that German logistics could never match. The disparity wasn't just numerical. German artillery officers had to conserve ammunition, firing only at high-value targets with carefully calculated trajectories. American gunners could bracket targets with multiple ranging shots, adjust fire with spotter aircraft, and saturate entire grid squares. The difference in capability stemmed directly from logistics. American supply trucks that could swim delivered ammunition faster than guns could fire it. German supply trucks that frequently broke down and lacked fuel delivered ammunition slower than combat consumed it. By the evening of March 24th, American forces had established bridgeheads across the Rhine at 6 separate locations. Engineers were constructing pontoon bridges to supplement the DUKWs, but the amphibious trucks had already delivered sufficient forces to secure the eastern bank. German counterattacks launched against these bridgeheads discovered American troops dug in with full ammunition stocks, supported by armour that had crossed on DUKWs modified to carry light tanks. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann's anti-tank gun position engaged an American Sherman tank that afternoon. His first shot struck the tank's glacis plate and ricocheted harmlessly. Before his crew could reload, American infantry suppressed his position with rifle and machine gun fire. The Sherman manoeuvred to flank his gun. Hoffmann ordered his crew to abandon the position. As they retreated, he watched another Sherman being unloaded from a DUKW at the riverbank. The amphibious truck had transported a 30-ton tank across the Rhine, up the muddy bank, and was now lowering it onto solid ground using built-in hydraulic ramps. "They're not invading," Hoffmann said to no one in particular. "They're relocating, as if Germany is just another place to drive their trucks." This perception captured something profound about American operations. The Wehrmacht was fighting desperately for survival. Every defensive position mattered. Every weapon was precious. Every soldier is irreplaceable. But the Americans seemed to be conducting a massive logistics exercise that happened to involve combat. Their vehicles drove from France to Germany as if following a delivery route. Their supplies flowed with commercial efficiency. Their casualties were evacuated with the speed and care of industrial accidents being processed through safety systems. The DUKW medical evacuation capability particularly demoralized German troops. Traditional battlefield medicine required wounded soldiers to be carried to aid stations, then transported to field hospitals by ambulance, often over rough roads and under fire. Many died from shock, blood loss, or infection during the journey. German medical officers had calculated expected mortality rates based on these delays. American wounded were being evacuated within minutes of injury. DUKWs converted to ambulances could drive directly to aid stations, load stretcher cases, and transport them across the Rhine to hospital ships in calm water. The stable ride prevented further injury. Medical personnel could administer treatment during Ridus transit. Soldiers who would have died in German care were in surgery within an hour of being wounded. Stabsarzt Karl Weber, a German military physician captured near Obergefreiter, observed American medical evacuation procedures. "They've eliminated time as a factor in battlefield medicine," he reported during interrogation. "Their wounded travel from the front line to the operating room faster than ours travel from the front line to the aid station. The survival rates must be extraordinary." This capability extended beyond humane treatment to practical military advantage. Soldiers knew they would receive immediate care if wounded. This knowledge maintained morale and aggression in combat. German troops, aware that wounds often meant death from delayed treatment, became more cautious. The difference in tactical behavior stemmed directly from logistics. Amphibious ambulances created confidence that traditional medical evacuation could never match. The night of March 24th, Obergefreiter Hermann's unit received orders to fall back another 15 kilometers. The American advance had bypassed their position. Remaining in place would achieve nothing except isolation and eventual capture. The withdrawal began in darkness, German infantry moving cross-country to avoid American patrols on the main roads. During the march, Hermann's squad encountered a cluster of abandoned American vehicles near a destroyed bridge. One DUKW sat at the water's edge, its front axle broken by a mine or artillery near miss. The crew had stripped it of weapons and radios but left the vehicle itself. Hermann's men examined it carefully, hoping to salvage fuel or supplies. "Look at this," said Gefreiter Paul Schneider, pointing to markings on the hull. "This vehicle was built in March 1944. It's been in service for exactly 1 year. The engine has been replaced at least twice. You can see different serial numbers on the mounting brackets. The transmission was swapped out. Multiple tires have been changed, but they just kept repairing it and sending it back into service." Hermann understood the implication. German military vehicles were maintained meticulously, with careful records and scheduled overhauls. When components wore out, mechanics performed precise repairs to extend service life. The Americans simply replaced worn parts with new ones from abundant stocks. When a vehicle became too damaged to justify further repair, they pushed it aside and brought up another. The DUKW near the riverbank wasn't carefully disabled. It was abandoned like a disposable tool. "We're fighting a nation that treats trucks as expendable," Hermann said. "How do you defeat an enemy with that kind of abundance?" Schneider had no answer. Neither did any German soldier who had witnessed American logistics. The industrial capacity gap had become unbridgeable. Germany's total truck production for 1945 would not equal the DUKWs alone that America had already built. Adding jeeps, standard cargo trucks, tank transporters, and specialized vehicles, American automotive production exceeded German output by factors of 10 or more. This abundance manifested in every aspect of the river crossings. American forces didn't carefully husband their DUKWs. They used them hard, accepting mechanical failures, battle damage, and losses. When vehicles broke down, crews often didn't stop to repair them. They simply radioed for another DUKW to continue the mission. Disabled vehicles were recovered later or cannibalized for parts. The operation never paused. German defenders, accustomed to precious equipment operated with maximum care, found this disposable approach incomprehensible. Lieutenant Hoffman watched American forces push a damaged DUKW into the Rhine rather than repair it on the beach. "They threw away more metal in that one vehicle than my entire company has for all purposes," he observed. "This isn't warfare. This is industrial overflow applied to military problems." The DUKWs also enabled American forces to exploit opportunities that German doctrine considered impossible. On March 25, elements of the 87th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine at Boppard using DUKWs and landing craft. German defensive positions at this location were weaker than at planned crossing sites farther north. American commanders, observing this weakness, simply redirected DUTWs to Boppard. Within hours, a full division was crossing at a point German planners had considered unlikely. This flexibility derived from the DUKW's fundamental characteristic. It required no specialized infrastructure. Traditional landing craft needed suitable beaches, offloading zones, and approach routes. DUKWs could enter the water at any point with sufficient depth, cross at any location without strong current, and exit onto any bank with less than a 30-degree slope. This meant the Rhine's entire length became a potential crossing point. German forces couldn't defend everywhere, and Americans could cross anywhere. Hauptmann Werner Richter compiled this reality into a stark assessment. The Americans have approximately 6,000 amphibious trucks available in the European theatre. Each can cross at any point along hundreds of kilometers of river frontage. Each can deliver 2.5 tons of cargo or 25 troops per trip. Each can make multiple trips per day. The mathematics is overwhelming. Even if we destroy 10% per day, they replace them faster than we can attrit them. Even if we defend every likely crossing site, they simply cross at unlikely ones. We have no response to this capability. The report reached General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army. He read it carefully, made notes in the margins, then filed it with other intelligence assessments describing American material superiority. The report changed nothing. German forces would continue fighting because surrender was unthinkable, and retreat only delayed the inevitable. But Manteuffel understood what Richter had documented. The DUKWs represented a fundamental shift in military operations. Americans had industrialized river crossing until it became routine. The broader implications extended beyond the Rhine. Every defensive line Germany hoped to establish relied on water obstacles. The Weser River, the Elbe River, the countless smaller rivers and canals crisscrossing Germany. Each was supposed to slow the American advance, create choke points vulnerable to counterattack, and buy time for reorganization. But if Americans could cross rivers at will using ordinary trucks modified with boat hulls, then every water obstacle became merely another stretch of road. This realization spread through German ranks during late March. Officers briefing their troops on defensive positions no longer emphasized river lines. Soldiers digging trenches along riverbanks understood they were establishing positions that would be bypassed rather than assaulted. The psychological effect was corrosive. If rivers couldn't stop the Americans, what could? Obergefreiter Hermann's unit established new defensive positions near Limburg on March 27. The Rhine River flowed a few kilometers to their south. In earlier weeks, officers would have positioned forces along the river to contest crossings. Instead, the unit dug in 5 kilometers north of the water. The unspoken assumption was clear. Americans would cross the Lahn without difficulty. The defense would occur inland, away from water obstacles that no longer mattered. That night, Hermann sat in a foxhole with Gefreiter Schneider, listening to distant engines. The sound had become constant, American vehicles moving, always moving, never pausing. The mechanical rumble was punctuated occasionally by artillery fire or small arms, but the underlying drone of motors never stopped. "Do you remember what the propaganda said at the beginning?" Schneider asked. "Americans were soft, dependent on machines, would collapse once we broke their equipment." "I remember," Hermann replied. "We were told their strength was also their weakness. Break the machines, break the army." But the machines don't break, or when they do, there are always more machines. Schneider lit a cigarette, cupping it carefully to hide the glow. "We're not fighting an army, we're fighting an industrial system, and you can't defeat an industrial system with tactics." Hermann didn't respond. The observation was accurate and depressing. German soldiers could outfight American soldiers in individual engagements. Wehrmacht units could execute tactical maneuvers with precision. American forces struggled to match. German officers understood operational art at levels American commanders rarely achieved. None of it mattered when the enemy had unlimited supplies delivered by trucks that swam. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.